In the vast expanse of space, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, humanity had always been considered the quiet neighbor. Not the strongest, not the smartest, certainly not the most technologically advanced. Just there. Existing in their small corner of the galaxy with their peculiar habits and strange sense of humor. So when the mighty Zephyrian Empire, rulers of 300 star systems and conquerors of a dozen species, sent their most fearsome war fleet to Earth's doorstep with declarations of impending conquest, they expected terror. They expected pleading. They expected desperate negotiations for mercy. What they didn't expect was for the human envoy to walk into the most important diplomatic meeting in galactic history, sit down across from their supreme war commander, unfold a newspaper, and start reading the sports section while casually asking if anyone wanted coffee. This is the story of how humanity accidentally became the most feared species in the galaxy, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through something far more terrifying to a conquest-minded empire, complete and utter indifference to being conquered. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. Sometimes it's just the ability to shrug and say, "That's nice, dear," when someone threatens to destroy your entire civilization. The morning started like any other Tuesday for Ambassador Margaret Chen. She woke up at precisely 6:30, made herself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and checked her schedule while her cat, Mr. Whiskers, demanded breakfast with increasingly dramatic meows. Her assistant had left a note about some alien delegation wanting to meet, but, honestly, that happened at least twice a week these days. Ever since humanity had joined the Galactic Council 5 years ago, everyone wanted to talk. Margaret had been Earth's chief diplomatic representative for the better part of a decade. She'd negotiated trade deals with the crystal beings from Andromeda, smoothed over territorial disputes with the gas cloud entities from the Veil Nebula, and once spent 3 hours explaining why humans couldn't simply stop being so emotional to a species that communicated entirely through mathematical equations. She'd seen it all, heard it all, and developed what her colleagues called an impressive tolerance for cosmic nonsense. The Zephyrian Empire's arrival, however, was anything but typical, though Margaret wouldn't realize this until much later. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Earth's orbital defense systems detected the largest fleet ever recorded entering Sol system. 300 massive warships, each the size of a small moon, emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. Their hulls gleamed like polished obsidian, bristling with weapons that could crack planets and shields that had withstood the firepower of entire civilizations. The lead vessel, a colossal dreadnought called the Eternal Dominion, was so large it briefly eclipsed the sun when it passed between Earth and the solar disk. Admiral Rebecca Torres, head of Earth's Space Defense Force, immediately went to red alert. Klaxons blared across every military installation on the planet and in orbit. Fighter squadrons scrambled. The few defense platforms humanity had managed to build powered up their weapons, though everyone knew they might as well be throwing pebbles at a mountain. "Get me the president," Torres barked to her communications officer. "And someone wake up the UN Security Council. We've got a situation." But before any of Earth's military leaders could figure out what to do about an invasion force that outgunned them by roughly 1,000 to 1, the Zephyrian fleet did something unexpected. They stopped. Just stopped. The massive armada hung in space like a collection of deadly ornaments, weapons powered but not firing, shields up but not advancing. Then came the message. The transmission appeared simultaneously on every screen, every device, every electronic display on Earth. The face that materialized was imposing in a way that made Hollywood villains look like cuddly teddy bears. Supreme War Commander Vex Thulzer had the classic Zephyrian features, midnight blueskin stretched over a skull that seemed designed by someone who thought regular skulls weren't intimidating enough, 6 eyes that glowed like dying stars, and a mouth full of teeth that could probably bite through steel. He wore armor that looked like it had been forged from the heart of a dead galaxy, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of conquest. "People of Earth," the war commander began, his words somehow translated perfectly into every language on the planet. "I am Supreme War Commander Vex Thulzer of the Zephyrian Empire, conqueror of the Andorian systems, subjugator of the Helix Nebula, and destroyer of the Resistance Coalition. You have exactly 72 of your planetary rotations to surrender your world unconditionally, or we will demonstrate why 400 species have knelt before the might of Zephyr." The transmission showed brief flashes of other worlds, cities reduced to glass, mountains carved with Zephyrian victory monuments, and species that had once ruled star systems now serving as manual laborers on Zephyrian mining colonies. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed to break the spirit of any civilization before the first shot was fired. Your pathetic defenses cannot stand against us, Vexthul continued, gesturing to what appeared to be tactical displays showing Earth's military installations. Your weapons are toys. Your shields are paper. Your courage will melt like ice before our fury. Send your most capable negotiator to discuss terms of surrender. They will meet us aboard the Eternal Dominion in exactly 48 hours. Do not make us wait. The transmission ended, leaving Earth in chaos. President Martinez called an emergency session of every government on Earth. The UN General Assembly went into permanent session. Religious leaders prayed to every deity humanity had ever imagined. Scientists worked frantically to calculate if there was any possible way to evacuate even a small portion of Earth's population. Military commanders ran simulation after simulation, each one ending with the same result: complete annihilation in approximately 17 minutes. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen finished reading the morning news over her second cup of tea and wondered why her assistant hadn't shown up for work yet. She found out when she arrived at the diplomatic center in Geneva to discover it had been transformed into something resembling a war room crossed with a panic room crossed with what appeared to be the set of a disaster movie. People in expensive suits ran back and forth carrying tablets and shouting into phones. At least 3 people were crying. Someone had set up a coffee station that looked like it was expecting to serve refugees from the apocalypse. "Oh good, Margaret, you're here," called Director Hamilton, the head of Earth's diplomatic corps. He looked like he'd aged about 10 years since yesterday and was apparently surviving entirely on caffeine and stress hormones. "We need you to negotiate with the Zephyrians." Margaret blinked. "The who?" "The aliens. The war fleet. The ones who want to conquer Earth." Hamilton thrust a tablet at her, showing the recording of Vexthul's message. "They want our best negotiator, and that's you." Margaret watched the transmission with the same expression she might use when observing a particularly dramatic performance at the local theater. When it finished, she handed the tablet back and shrugged. "Well, that's certainly something," she said. "I suppose I should pack an overnight bag." Hamilton stared at her. Around them, the controlled chaos of humanity's government trying to prevent the end of the world continued. "Margaret, do you understand what's happening here? This is an invasion. They're going to destroy our entire civilization if we don't surrender." "Yes, I got that from the dramatic speech," Margaret replied, checking her watch. "Though I have to say, the presentation could use some work. Very over the top." "When do they want to meet?" "Tomorrow. On their flagship." "Margaret, this isn't just another trade negotiation. These beings have conquered hundreds of worlds. They've destroyed entire species. This is probably the most important diplomatic mission in human history." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I should probably bring my good pen then. And maybe some biscuits. Long meetings always go better with biscuits." While Hamilton tried to figure out if Earth's chief diplomat was having some sort of stress-induced breakdown, Margaret was already mentally planning her approach. She'd been in tense negotiations before. The key was always to remain calm, be prepared, and never let the other party see you sweat. Though admittedly, most of her previous negotiations hadn't involved the potential extinction of her entire species. That evening, as Earth's governments frantically tried to prepare for humanity's surrender or annihilation, Margaret sat in her apartment reading a novel and occasionally scratching Mr. Whiskers behind the ears. Her suitcase sat by the door, packed with the essentials: 3 changes of clothes, her diplomatic credentials, a thermos of tea, yesterday's newspaper which she hadn't finished, and a tin of shortbread cookies from her favorite bakery in Edinburgh. She'd also packed her lucky pen, the one she'd used to sign the peace treaty with the Crystalline Collective, and her reading glasses, because you never knew when you might need to review fine print, even when negotiating humanity's surrender to a galactic empire. The next morning, as Margaret prepared to leave for what might be the most crucial meeting in human history, her neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door to ask if she could water Margaret's plants while she was away. "Oh, just a short business trip," Margaret explained, taking one last sip of her morning tea. "Should be back by Thursday, but you know how these things go. Sometimes meetings run long." Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically. "International relations can be such a bother." "Well, don't let them push you around, dear. You know how these foreign types can be." Margaret smiled and agreed that yes, she would certainly keep that in mind. The transport shuttle that carried Margaret to the Zephyrian flagship was probably the most advanced piece of technology she'd ever been inside, though she spent most of the journey reading her newspaper and occasionally glancing out the window to admire the view. The pilot, a nervous young man from Earth's Space Corps who kept glancing at her like she was either the bravest or most insane person he'd ever met, tried several times to brief her on what to expect. "Ambassador, the Zephyrian vessel is enormous," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Sensors indicate it's roughly the size of Manhattan, with weapon systems that could sterilize a continent. The hull is made from some kind of exotic alloy we can't identify, and the energy readings suggest power sources beyond our current understanding." Margaret murmured, turning a page. "That's nice, dear. Oh look, they're saying the cricket match might be rained out. What a shame. Ma'am, with respect, this might be the most dangerous diplomatic mission in human history. These beings have conquered hundreds of worlds. They've never been known to show mercy." Margaret looked up from her paper with a gentle smile. "Young man, I once spent 6 hours in a room with the hegemony of Tau Ceti while they explained why humans smelled offensive and should be relocated to the galactic equivalent of a leper colony. I survived that. I think I can manage one meeting with some overly dramatic conquerors." The docking bay of the Eternal Dominion was clearly designed to intimidate. Everything was massive, angular, and colored in shades of black and deep red that suggested either sophisticated aesthetic choices or a species with some serious psychological issues. The bay was large enough to hold several city blocks, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above massive support beams that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular architecture wasn't menacing enough. Hundreds of Zephyrian soldiers lined the walls, each one standing at perfect attention in armor that seemed to absorb light. They were tall, imposing figures with that characteristic midnight blue skin and glowing eyes that tracked Margaret's every movement as she disembarked from the shuttle. The air hummed with the barely contained energy of weapons systems and the low throb of the ship's massive engines. At the center of the bay waited a delegation of Zephyrian officers, their armor more elaborate and their weapons more ornate than those of the common soldiers. At their head stood a figure who could only be Supreme War Commander Vex Thulzar himself. In person, he was even more intimidating than his holographic image had suggested. Nearly 8 feet tall, with 6 eyes that glowed like embers and a presence that seemed to fill the entire bay, he was clearly designed by evolution, genetic modification, or possibly artistic choice to be the sort of being that made entire civilizations surrender just by showing up. Behind him stood his senior staff, Admiral Kreshtar the Destroyer, whose scarred armor told the story of 100 conquered worlds, General Mordun the Merciless, whose strategic genius had broken the last organized resistance in the Outer Rim, and War Savant Yexai, whose calculations could predict the fall of civilizations with mathematical precision. They watched Margaret approach with expressions that suggested they were seeing something unexpected and possibly concerning. The human delegate was not what they'd anticipated. They'd expected either a warrior, a scholar diplomat with elaborate credentials, or possibly a religious figure of some sort. What they got was a middle-aged woman in a sensible gray suit carrying a briefcase and what appeared to be a newspaper tucked under her arm. Margaret walked across the vast space with the easy confidence of someone heading to a routine business meeting, occasionally glancing around with the polite interest of a tourist visiting a particularly dramatic cathedral. When she reached the waiting delegation, she stopped, smiled pleasantly, and extended her hand. "You must be Commander Vex Thul. I'm Margaret Chen, Earth's diplomatic representative. Pleasure to meet you." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either violence or profound confusion. Vex Thul stared down at the offered hand as if it might be some sort of weapon he'd never encountered before. The concept of a handshake was apparently not part of Zephyrian diplomatic protocol. "You are." Vex Thul's voice was like distant thunder. "The best your species has to offer?" "Oh, I wouldn't say the best," Margaret replied, lowering her hand when it became clear the handshake wasn't happening. But I'm reasonably good with this sort of thing. Now, shall we get started? I have to say, this is a lovely ship. Very dramatic. The walk to the conference chamber was clearly intended as another exercise in intimidation. The corridors of the Eternal Dominion were vast enough to fly aircraft through, lit by what appeared to be captured starlight and decorated with what Margaret assumed were either artistic representations of conquered worlds or possibly actual preserved fragments of them. Every surface was covered with symbols that probably meant something threatening in Zephyrian, and the few crew members they passed all stopped what they were doing to stare at the human diplomat with expressions of bewilderment. Margaret maintained a stream of pleasant small talk as they walked, commenting on the architecture, asking polite questions about the ship's design, and once stopping to admire what appeared to be a trophy case filled with the crowns and scepters of fallen rulers. Now that's interesting craftsmanship, she said, studying a particularly ornate crown that sparkled with what were probably imprisoned stars. Is that from the Crystal Worlds? I met their ambassador last year. Lovely people, though they do tend to sing instead of talking, which can make negotiations rather musical. Vexthal exchanged glances with his staff. According to their intelligence, the Crystal Worlds had been conquered and their royal family executed nearly 2 decades ago. Either this human was remarkably well informed about galactic politics or remarkably ignorant about recent history. The conference chamber was, predictably, enormous and designed to make anyone sitting across from the Zephyrian delegation feel small and insignificant. The table was made from what appeared to be polished obsidian and was large enough to land a small spacecraft on. The Zephyrian side featured high-backed chairs that looked like thrones carved from nightmare, while the human side had been provided with a single, rather ordinary chair that looked like it had been borrowed from an office somewhere. Margaret settled into her seat, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a legal pad, her pen, the thermos of tea, and the newspaper she'd been reading. She arranged these items on the table with the methodical efficiency of someone preparing for a routine business meeting, then looked up expectantly. Right then, she said, uncapping her pen. Shall we begin? The next hour was unlike anything in Vexthal's extensive experience of conquest negotiations. Usually, conquered species followed a predictable pattern. They began with defiance, moved through bargaining and pleading, and ended with either surrender or desperate final threats. What they didn't do was sit across from him reading newspaper articles about local sports while he explained the terms of their species' subjugation. The Zephyrian Empire requires complete surrender of all military assets, Vexthal announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Your governments will be dissolved. Your leaders will be executed as examples. Your population will be relocated to designated work colonies. Margaret murmured, making notes on her legal pad. And I suppose you'll want all our technological databases as well? Standard procedure, I imagine. The casual acknowledgement was not what Vexthal had expected. You understand what I am telling you? Oh yes, complete conquest, dissolution of governments, work colonies, probably some sort of tribute system afterward, Margaret said, not looking up from her notes. Very thorough. You've clearly done this before. She turned a page in her newspaper and began reading what appeared to be an article about a local flower show. Oh, would you look at that? Mrs. Henderson's roses won first prize again. 3rd year running. Good for her. Admiral Kreshtar leaned forward. Human, do you comprehend that we are discussing the end of your civilization? Margaret glanced up from her paper. Yes, I got that bit. Very dramatic presentation, by the way. Though I have to ask, when you say work colonies, are we talking agricultural, mining, or manufacturing? It's just that humans have various skill sets, and proper placement can really improve productivity. The silence that followed was broken only by the low hum of the ship's engines and what might have been the distant sound of war savant Yexhai frantically recalculating something on his tactical computer. You wish to negotiate the terms of your slavery? General Mordaunt asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion that was probably the first time in his career he'd experienced that particular emotion during a conquest meeting. Well, I certainly want to understand what we're agreeing to, Margaret replied reasonably. It's only sensible. Now, about food production. I assume you'll be expecting the colonies to be self-sufficient? Humans do have rather specific dietary requirements. Vexthal found himself in the unprecedented situation of having to explain conquest logistics to someone who was treating the end of their world like a bureaucratic procedure. By the time Margaret had worked her way through questions about housing standards, medical care for elderly workers, and whether humans would be permitted to maintain their educational systems for children, he was beginning to suspect that either this species was completely insane or he was missing something important. Your questions are unusual, he said finally. Are they? Margaret asked, pouring herself a cup of tea from her thermos. I suppose different species have different approaches to these things. Would anyone else like some tea? I brought extra cups. The offer of tea to the beings who were in the process of conquering her planet was, Vexthal decided, the most confusing thing that had ever happened to him in 3 centuries of warfare. The tea offer created what military historians would later describe as the first recorded instance of a galactic conquest being temporarily paused due to beverage-related confusion. Vexthal stared at Margaret for several long moments, his 6 eyes blinking in what might have been an attempt to process information his 3-century military career had not prepared him for. You are offering us refreshments, he said slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. Well, yes, Margaret replied, already pouring herself a cup. It's Earl Grey. Quite good, actually. I find long meetings always go better with a bit of tea. Helps everyone stay civilized. War savant Yexai, whose tactical computer could calculate the fall of star systems, was now running probability algorithms that kept returning results like error, scenario not found, and impossible input parameters. He leaned toward his commander and spoke in rapid Zephyrian. Sir, this does not match any conquest pattern in our databases. The human appears to be treating this as a standard diplomatic negotiation rather than a surrender proceeding. I can see that, Vexthal growled. What does your analysis suggest? 3 possibilities, sir. First, the human is insane. Second, this is some form of psychological warfare we have not encountered. Third, there is something about this species we have fundamentally misunderstood. Margaret, meanwhile, had finished setting up her tea and was back to reading her newspaper. She occasionally made small sounds of interest at various articles, once tooting softly at what appeared to be a particularly disappointing cricket score. Perhaps, Admiral Kreshtar suggested, his scarred features showing the strain of trying to adapt to an unprecedented situation, we should clarify the terms for the human. Vexthal nodded and straightened in his throne-like chair, reasserting his commanding presence. Human delegate, let me be absolutely clear. The Zephyrian Empire does not negotiate. We conquer. Your species has no military capability that can threaten us. Your defenses are meaningless. You have no choice but complete surrender. Margaret looked up from an article about a controversy involving the local library's book club. Oh, I understand that completely. You've got us thoroughly outgunned. No question about it. The casual acknowledgement of complete military superiority should have ended the discussion, but somehow it didn't. Instead, Margaret continued as if they were discussing the weather. It's just that, well, since we're going to be part of your empire anyway, we might as well make sure everything runs smoothly, don't you think? I mean, you wouldn't want any unnecessary problems with administration or productivity. That just makes things difficult for everyone. She took a sip of her tea and continued. Now, I've been looking at your terms, and they're quite comprehensive. Very thorough. But, I notice you haven't mentioned anything about cultural preservation protocols or knowledge transfer procedures. Surely you'll want to maintain access to human expertise during the transition period? General Mordun, whose strategic brilliance had broken the resistance of dozens of species, found himself completely unprepared for resistance that sounded like cooperation. Cultural preservation? Knowledge transfer? Well, yes, Margaret said, pulling out what appeared to be a prepared document from her briefcase. Humans have developed quite a lot of useful technology over the years. Medical advances, agricultural techniques, that sort of thing. I assume you'll want to catalog all of that before restructuring our society. And then, there's the question of maintaining historical records, art collections, libraries. Purely for archival purposes, of course. She handed the document to a bewildered aide who looked to Vexthal for guidance. I've prepared a preliminary assessment of Earth's intellectual and cultural assets. Just a rough outline, mind you, but it should give you an idea of what you're acquiring. Vexthal accepted the document and scanned its contents. What he found was a meticulously organized catalog of human achievements, scientific discoveries, artistic works, philosophical treatises, historical documents, technological innovations, and cultural practices. It was the kind of comprehensive documentation that the Empire's bureaucrats usually spent months compiling after a conquest. "You prepared this, before the meeting?" he asked. "Oh yes, as soon as I heard about your Empire's interest in Earth. I thought it would save time." Margaret smiled pleasantly. "I do try to be thorough in these matters." The document was impressive in its scope and organization. More troubling, it suggested a level of intellectual and cultural sophistication that the Empire's initial assessment had missed. Humans, according to this catalog, had developed advanced mathematics, sophisticated literature, complex philosophy, and innovative solutions to problems the Empire hadn't even realized were problems. War savant Yexai's computer was now running increasingly frantic calculations. "Sir, if this document is accurate, this species may be more valuable as integrated citizens than as laborers." "That's very kind of you to say," Margaret said, apparently having overheard the whispered conversation. "Though I should point out that the document only covers our major achievements. There are quite a lot of minor innovations that might be useful as well. Humans are rather good at finding creative solutions to everyday problems." Admiral Kreshtar studied the human delegate with growing confusion. "You speak as though you expect to survive this conquest." "Well, yes," Margaret replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "I mean, what would be the point of conquering a species just to eliminate all their useful knowledge and capabilities? That seems terribly inefficient." The logic was unassailable and completely contrary to everything the Zephyrian Empire had ever done. Their standard conquest protocol involved crushing all resistance, eliminating leadership, and reducing conquered populations to basic labor functions. The idea that a conquered species might have something valuable to contribute beyond manual work was revolutionary. Besides, Margaret continued, returning to her newspaper, "I imagine managing an empire of your size requires quite a lot of administrative expertise. Humans have considerable experience with large-scale organizational management. We might actually be quite helpful." She paused to read what appeared to be a particularly amusing editorial, chuckling softly to herself. "Oh, that's clever. They're comparing the budget deficit to a leaky bucket. Very apt metaphor." Vexthal found himself in the unprecedented position of reconsidering a conquest that should have been a formality. The human delegate's casual competence and apparent assumption that humanity would survive integration into the Empire was unlike anything in his experience. More troubling, her assumptions seemed to be affecting his own thinking about the value of this particular conquest. "You assume," he said carefully, "that we would have use for human expertise." "Oh, I don't assume anything," Margaret replied, folding her newspaper neatly. "But, you wouldn't have built an empire spanning hundreds of worlds without considerable organizational skill. And any organization can benefit from fresh perspectives and additional expertise. Simple efficiency, really." She pulled out another document from her briefcase. "This is a preliminary analysis of potential integration points where human knowledge and capabilities might complement existing imperial systems. Nothing presumptuous, just some ideas about areas where we might be able to contribute." The second document was, if anything, more impressive than the first. It outlined potential applications of human technology and knowledge in areas ranging from agricultural optimization to diplomatic protocols to entertainment systems. It was clearly the work of someone who had studied the Zephyrian Empire's structure and identified specific areas where human capabilities might prove useful. "You have studied our empire," General Mordun observed. "Well, naturally. If we're going to be part of it, we should understand how it works," Margaret said. "Though I admit our information is probably incomplete." We've only had contact with galactic civilization for a few years. War Savant Yexhai was now running calculations on integration costs versus destruction costs, administrative efficiency models, and resource optimization scenarios. The results were beginning to suggest something that went against everything the Empire had ever done, that this conquest might actually be more valuable as a merger than as a subjugation. "Sir," he whispered to Vexthal, "the human appears to be conducting what amounts to a job interview." Vexthal realized with dawning horror that his tactical savant was correct. Somehow, without anyone noticing, the human delegate had shifted the conversation from discussing terms of surrender to discussing terms of employment. And, the most terrifying part was that it actually made sense. Margaret, meanwhile, had returned to her newspaper and was reading what appeared to be a review of a local theater production. "Oh, how lovely! They're doing Shakespeare this season. I haven't seen a good production of Hamlet in ages." The mention of cultural activities in the context of their current discussion was so surreal that Vexthal felt obliged to respond. "You attend theatrical performances?" "Oh yes, quite regularly. Humans are very fond of storytelling in various forms. Theater, literature, cinema, music. We find artistic expression quite important for psychological well-being." She glanced up from her paper. "I don't suppose your empire has much use for entertainment systems? Maintaining morale across hundreds of worlds must be quite a challenge." The casual suggestion that the mighty Zephyrian Empire might benefit from human entertainment was so unexpected that it took several moments for anyone to process it. When the implications sank in, War Savant Yexhai's computer began running new calculations about cultural integration, population management, and the long-term stability of conquered territories. "You believe," Vexthal said slowly, "that your species' cultural activities would be useful to the Empire?" "Well, happy citizens are productive citizens," Margaret replied pragmatically. "And humans have become quite good at creating engaging content. We've had considerable practice keeping ourselves entertained during peacetime." She poured herself another cup of tea and offered the thermos to the Zephyrian delegation again. This time, Admiral Kreshtar actually accepted a cup, more out of confusion than thirst. "This is quite good," he admitted after taking a cautious sip. "Earl Grey," Margaret said proudly. "A blend of black tea with bergamot oil. Humans have developed quite sophisticated approaches to beverage preparation. We're rather fond of our creature comforts." The idea that a species facing conquest would offer refreshments to their conquerors and, then, casually discuss the finer points of tea preparation was so far outside normal parameters that Vexthal was beginning to wonder if his 3 centuries of military experience were somehow inadequate for this situation. By hour 3 of what was supposed to have been a straightforward surrender ceremony, Vexthal was experiencing something entirely new in his military career: doubt about standard operating procedures. Margaret had somehow transformed the meeting into what appeared to be a comprehensive planning session for the integration of Earth into the Zephyrian Empire, complete with preliminary timelines, resource allocation suggestions, and what she called transition management protocols. "Now, regarding population relocation," Margaret was saying, consulting what appeared to be her 4th different preparatory document, "I assume you'll want to maintain some communities in their current locations for agricultural and industrial continuity. Humans have developed quite specialized regional expertise over the centuries." She spread out what looked like a detailed map of Earth marked with different colored annotations. "These areas represent our primary food production regions, our major industrial centers, and our research facilities. Disrupting all of them simultaneously might create unnecessary supply chain complications during the transition period." War Savant Yexhai studied the map with growing fascination. The human delegate had essentially prepared a comprehensive conquest plan for her own planet, complete with strategic assessments and logistical recommendations. It was more thorough than many of the Empire's own pre-invasion analyses. "This level of the cooperation is unprecedented," General Mordun observed. "Well, resistance would be rather pointless, wouldn't it?" Margaret replied reasonably. "You clearly have overwhelming military superiority. The logical response is to focus on making the transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved." She pointed to various locations on the map. "For instance, these universities represent considerable intellectual capital. destroying them would be wasteful. But relocating all the personnel might disrupt ongoing research that could benefit the Empire. Much more efficient to integrate them in place, at least initially. Admiral Kreshtar found himself actually studying the strategic recommendations. Your analysis assumes we would want to preserve these intellectual assets. Any well-managed empire would, Margaret said matter-of-factly. Knowledge is valuable. Destroying it serves no productive purpose. She pulled out yet another document, this one appearing to be some sort of economic analysis. Speaking of productivity, I've done some preliminary calculations on potential economic contributions. Earth's current output might seem insignificant compared to the Empire's scale, but there are several areas where we might provide useful specialization. The economic analysis was, like everything else Margaret had prepared, both comprehensive and, surprisingly sophisticated. It outlined Earth's current productive capacity, identified areas for potential expansion, and suggested integration points with existing imperial economic systems. It was the kind of report that imperial economists usually took months to compile. You prepared all of this, Vexthal said, gesturing to the growing collection of documents spread across the table, in 2 days. Oh, this is just the preliminary assessment, Margaret replied. Given more time, we could provide much more detailed analysis. Humans are quite good at research and documentation. She paused to sip her tea and glance at her newspaper. Though I should mention that some of this information came from our existing diplomatic archives. We've been studying galactic civilization since we joined the Council, so we already had quite a bit of background material on the Empire. The implications of that statement took a moment to sink in. Earth, despite being a minor player in galactic politics, had been systematically studying the major powers, including the Zephyrian Empire. They had been, in effect, doing intelligence gathering disguised as academic research. Your species has been studying us, Admiral Kreshtar said. Well, yes. Standard diplomatic practice, really. You can't conduct effective international relations without understanding the major players, Margaret said. Though I admit we never expected to need the information quite this urgently. War Savant Yexai's computer was now running scenarios that his programming had never anticipated. The tactical implications of conquering a species that had been systematically studying their potential conquerors were complex and troubling. Sir, he whispered to Vexthal, their intelligence gathering may be more sophisticated than our initial assessment suggested. I can hear you, Margaret said pleasantly. And, I assure you, there's nothing sinister about it. We study everyone we might potentially work with. The Crystalline Collective, the Helix Federation, the Independent Traders Alliance. It's just good diplomatic practice. She pulled out what appeared to be a summary document. In fact, our analysis of the Empire has been quite favorable. Very efficient organizational structure, excellent logistical capabilities, impressive technological integration across diverse species. You've clearly solved a number of complex administrative challenges. The casual praise of their organizational capabilities from a species they were in the process of conquering was so unprecedented that Vexthal found himself actually feeling pleased about the recognition. Of course, there are always areas for potential improvement, Margaret continued. No organization is perfect, no matter how successful. The room went very quiet. In 3 centuries of conquest, no one had ever suggested that the Zephyrian Empire might have room for improvement. The concept was so foreign that it took several moments for anyone to process it. You believe, General Mordaunt said carefully, that our empire could be improved. Oh, every organization can be improved, Margaret said cheerfully. It's the nature of complex systems. You identify inefficiencies, you adapt to changing conditions, you incorporate new ideas. Standard management practice, really. She pulled out another document. For instance, your current communication protocols are quite impressive, but there might be room for optimization in information flow between distant territories. And, your resource allocation algorithms, while sophisticated, might benefit from some of the distribution models humans have developed for managing supply chains across diverse environmental conditions. War savant Yexai's computer was now generating reports with titles like Potential Optimization Opportunities and Integration Benefits Analysis. The machine had apparently decided that this conversation was about business efficiency rather than military conquest and was adapting its analysis accordingly. "You have suggestions," Vexthal said slowly, "for improving the administration of our empire." "Just some ideas," Margaret replied modestly. "Nothing presumptuous. But humans have considerable experience with large-scale organizational management, and we've had to develop innovative approaches to resource allocation and communication coordination. Some of our solutions might be applicable to imperial systems." The business management consultation that was occurring in the middle of what should have been a conquest negotiation was so surreal that Vexthal was beginning to question whether he was still in the same reality he'd inhabited that morning. "This is," he said finally, "not how these meetings usually proceed." "Oh, I imagine every species approaches these situations differently," Margaret said. "We tend to focus on practical problem solving rather than dramatic posturing. It's just our nature." She glanced at her watch. "Speaking of which, we should probably discuss timeline expectations. These integration projects can be quite complex, and proper planning is essential for successful implementation." Margaret pulled out what appeared to be a project management timeline. "Based on the scope of the integration, I'd estimate we'll need at least 18 months for full implementation, assuming adequate resource allocation and coordination between Earth and Imperial administrative systems." The timeline was detailed, realistic, and completely insane. It treated the conquest of Earth as if it were a corporate merger, complete with phases for personnel integration, technology transfer, cultural orientation, and what Margaret called optimization of administrative interfaces. "You have planned," Admiral Kreshtar said, staring at the timeline, "the conquest of your own planet." "I prefer to think of it as an integration project," Margaret corrected gently. "Conquest implies destruction and waste. Integration suggests cooperation and mutual benefit." War savant Yexai was now running calculations that were producing results his tactical programming had never anticipated. According to his analysis, implementing the human delegate's integration plan would be more efficient, more profitable, and more strategically valuable than standard conquest procedures. "Sir," he reported to Vexthal, "the human's proposal appears to be superior to our standard protocols." The admission that a conquered species had devised a better plan for their own subjugation than the Empire's military strategists was so unprecedented that it created what could only be described as a philosophical crisis in the command structure. Margaret, meanwhile, had returned to reading her newspaper and was chuckling at what appeared to be a humorous column about gardening mishaps. "Oh, that's quite funny. This fellow tried to grow prize-winning tomatoes and ended up with something that looks like alien vegetables. Though I suppose from your perspective, they'd just be regular vegetables." The casual joke about alien perspectives in the middle of a discussion about the integration of Earth into a galactic empire was so perfectly timed and so completely absurd that Admiral Kreshtar actually found himself smiling. "Your species," he said, "has an unusual approach to crisis management." "Crisis?" Margaret looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh, you mean the conquest? Well, I suppose it could be viewed as a crisis, but it's really more of an opportunity, isn't it? Change always brings new possibilities." The idea that being conquered by a galactic empire could be viewed as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe was so fundamentally different from anything in their experience that the Zephyrian command staff found themselves reconsidering basic assumptions about the nature of conquest itself. Vexthal realized that somewhere in the course of this impossible meeting, the human delegate had managed to reframe the entire situation. Instead of discussing the terms of Earth's surrender, they were now planning what amounted to a voluntary merger between Earth and the Empire, with humanity as enthusiastic junior partners rather than conquered subjects. 6 hours after the meeting was scheduled to end, Margaret was packing up her documents while the Zephyrian command staff sat in stunned silence around the obsidian table. What had begun as a surrender ceremony had somehow transformed into the most comprehensive integration planning session in the Empire's history. "Well, I think that covers the major points," Margaret said, checking items off what appeared to be a meeting agenda. The preliminary integration timeline, resource allocation protocols, administrative interface specifications, and cultural preservation guidelines should give us a solid foundation to work from. She paused to finish the last of her tea. Of course, we'll need regular progress reviews once implementation begins. I suggest monthly status meetings for the first year, then quarterly reviews after that. Large projects like this require careful monitoring to ensure they stay on track. Vexthal found his voice after several moments of processing. You are satisfied with these arrangements? Oh, quite satisfied, Margaret replied cheerfully. Though I do think we should establish clear communication channels between Earth's administrative representatives and the imperial bureaucracy. Miscommunication can derail even the best planned projects. She pulled out a business card and placed it on the table. My contact information, in case any questions arise during implementation. I'm generally available during standard business hours, though I can be reached in emergencies. The business card, sitting on the table next to documents outlining humanity's integration into a galactic empire, was possibly the most surreal object Vexthal had ever encountered. It read, Margaret Chen, Senior Diplomatic Representative, Earth Confederated Governments, and included what appeared to be an email address and phone number. You expect, General Mordun said slowly, to continue in a diplomatic capacity after the integration. Well, naturally. Someone will need to coordinate between Earth's existing administrative structures and imperial systems during the transition period, Margaret said, packing her thermos back into her briefcase. Continuity of management is essential for these kinds of projects. War Savant Yexai's computer had long since given up trying to categorize this situation and was simply recording it as unprecedented administrative procedure, further analysis required. Besides, Margaret continued, I imagine the Empire could use someone familiar with human administrative practices, at least until your regular staff can be brought up to speed on our systems. The casual assumption that Imperial staff would need to learn human administrative practices rather than the reverse was so contrary to normal conquest procedures that it took several moments for anyone to process the implications. Admiral Kreshtar finally spoke. Your species appears to view this situation as a business partnership. Well, yes. That's essentially what it is, isn't it? Margaret replied, checking her watch. The Empire gains access to Earth's resources and capabilities, and humanity gains the benefits of membership in a successful galactic organization. Standard mutual benefit arrangement. She stood and smoothed down her skirt. I should probably head back to Earth and brief our governments on the final arrangements. They'll want to begin implementation planning right away. The idea that Earth's governments would be eager to begin planning their integration into the Empire was so far removed from typical conquest scenarios that Vexthal felt as though he'd somehow slipped into an alternate reality where basic principles of military subjugation no longer applied. There is one thing, Margaret said, pausing at the door. I noticed your empire doesn't seem to have standardized protocols for voluntary integration. Most of your procedures appear designed for resistant populations. She turned back to face the command staff. You might want to consider developing some alternative approaches. I suspect there are other species out there who would be interested in partnership arrangements if the terms were attractive enough. The suggestion that the Zephyrian Empire might benefit from offering voluntary membership rather than conquest was so revolutionary that it challenged the fundamental basis of imperial expansion policy. Voluntary membership? Vexthal repeated. Certainly. Look at it from a cost-benefit perspective, Margaret said, returning to her businesslike tone. Military conquest is expensive. You have to maintain large fleets, replace equipment lost in battle, deal with ongoing resistance movements, and manage hostile populations. Voluntary integration eliminates most of those costs while providing access to the same resources and capabilities. She pulled out her final document, a summary analysis she'd apparently prepared while everyone else was trying to process what was happening. I've run some preliminary numbers based on publicly available data about Imperial operations. The cost savings from voluntary integration versus military conquest could be substantial. War Savant Yexai automatically accepted the document and began scanning its contents. The analysis was sophisticated, comprehensive, and suggested that Margaret Chen had just casually solved one of the Empire's major long-term strategic challenges. Of course, you'd need to adjust your recruitment approach, Margaret continued. Instead of sending war fleets to threaten potential members, you might consider sending trade delegations to discuss partnership opportunities. Much more cost-effective, and probably more appealing to species that value economic stability. The idea that the mighty Zephyrian Empire might achieve better expansion results through trade negotiations than military threats was so fundamentally different from everything they'd ever done that it required a complete reconceptualization of imperial strategy. "You are suggesting," General Mordaunt said carefully, "that we change our approach to expansion." "Just a thought," Margaret said modestly. "Though you might want to test the concept on a smaller scale first. Maybe approach some of the independent systems that are currently neutral. See if they'd be interested in partnership agreements." She picked up her briefcase and newspaper. "But that's all strategic planning for the future. Right now, we should focus on making this integration as successful as possible. It could serve as a model for future voluntary memberships." As Margaret headed toward the door, Vexthal found himself asking the question that had been bothering him throughout the entire meeting. "Ambassador Chen, may I ask, why are you not afraid?" Margaret paused and considered the question seriously. "Fear? Of what? We came here to conquer your world. We have destroyed civilizations. We have weapons that can crack planets. Why does none of this concern you?" Margaret smiled with genuine warmth. "Commander, in my 40 years of diplomatic service, I've learned that most conflicts stem from misunderstandings, poor communication, or failure to identify mutual benefits. You have an impressive organization that's clearly very successful at what it does. Humans have capabilities and knowledge that could be useful to that organization. This situation has all the elements of a mutually beneficial arrangement." She paused thoughtfully. "Besides, being afraid wouldn't accomplish anything productive. Better to focus on practical solutions." The philosophical implications of that statement would keep imperial strategists busy for decades. Margaret headed for the door, then stopped and turned back one final time. "Oh, and, Commander? You might want to try the Earl Grey tea I left you. I think you'll find it quite relaxing. Sometimes the best solutions come when you're not trying so hard to be intimidating." 3 hours later, as Margaret's shuttle approached Earth, she was reading the final section of her newspaper and humming softly to herself. The cricket match had been rained out, which was disappointing, but the gardening column had included some excellent tips for winter vegetable cultivation. Behind her, the most powerful military fleet in the galaxy hung motionless in space while its commanders tried to figure out how they just accidentally recruited Earth as a voluntary member of the Zephyrian Empire instead of conquering it. On Earth, President Martinez and the UN Security Council were frantically preparing for either invasion or annihilation when they received Margaret's preliminary report: integration negotiations successful. Implementation begins next month. Suggest we start preparing welcome packages for Imperial administrative staff. Also recommend expanding tea production capabilities. Full briefing tomorrow at 0900 hours. 6 months later, the first Zephyrian Human Joint Administrative Conference was held in Geneva, featuring presentations on optimized resource distribution models, cross-species communication protocols, and the strategic applications of Earl Grey tea in diplomatic relations. The conference was such a success that 3 minor systems submitted applications for voluntary Imperial membership before it even concluded. Margaret Chen, now holding the title of Senior Integration Specialist for the Zephyrian Empire, spent her days doing exactly what she'd always done: reading her morning newspaper, drinking her tea, and helping people work together more efficiently. The galaxy, meanwhile, was slowly discovering that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't superior firepower or advanced technology. Sometimes it's just the ability to see an opportunity where everyone else sees a problem, offer someone a cup of tea, and calmly suggest that there might be a better way to do things. And sometimes, the best way to prevent a war is to hand your potential conqueror a business plan and ask if they'd like to be partners instead.